Today is April 4th. It's the 94th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. On this day in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. He is 39 years old. Born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929, King is a Baptist minister and a civil rights leader who promotes the use of nonviolent resistance in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, leading the call for an American society that is more equal and less separate. He founds the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, leads the Montgomery bus boycott, the 1963 March on Washington, where he gives his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He leads the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965. And on this day in 1967, he gives an anti-Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in New York, speaking out against the war and the policies that started it. In his speech, he says, quote, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. We still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation." Exactly 1 year later, on this day in 1968, King is in Memphis, Tennessee. He comes to Memphis the week before to organize a protest march in support of striking sanitation workers who are on strike following the deaths of two of their colleagues. But the march turns into a riot, and King is led away to safety and returns to Atlanta. King is dismayed by the debacle in Memphis. He and SCLC leaders regroup and plan another march for April 5th. On April 3rd, King flies back to Memphis, but his plane is delayed leaving Atlanta due to a bomb threat made against him. Once he finally arrives in Memphis, he checks into room 306 at the Lorraine Motel on Mulberry Street in Memphis. The Lorraine Motel is owned by Walter Bailey. He buys it in 1945, and during the segregation era, he runs it as an upscale establishment for black clientele. A lot of the singers and musicians who record at Stax Records recording studio stay there. Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett. After announcing the upcoming march, it is at the Lorraine Motel where King is served with a restraining order. When the press asks him for comment, his response is, quote, "We're not going to be stopped by mace or injunctions." King is scheduled to speak at Mason Temple that evening, but a tornado warning has been issued in Memphis, and King worries about the optics if the crowd isn't as big as it was when he spoke there the previous month, that the press would write about the end of the King era. He asks Ralph Abernathy to speak in his place. But when Abernathy arrives at Mason Temple and sees the crowd that has braved the wild storm to hear King speak, he calls King at the Lorraine Motel and urges him to come down to Mason Temple. King makes his way over and speaks to the assembled group as the storm rages outside. He speaks of the recent threats against his life, including the bomb threat that delayed his plane earlier that day. And he speaks of his vision of the future that he sees clearly and wants to share with his followers.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
In hindsight, his words seem prophetic. But Martin Luther King Jr. has long known what fate has in store for him. In November of 1963, 4.5 years earlier, when he hears that John F. Kennedy has been assassinated, he tells his wife, Coretta, quote, "This is what's going to happen to me also. I keep telling you, this is a sick society." King spends most of this day, April 4th, in 1968, in his room on the second floor of the Lorraine. Around 6 p.m., he steps out of room 306, leans over the balcony, and chats with one of his protégés, Jesse Jackson, who's down below in the car park. They're about to go to dinner, and King admonishes Jackson for not wearing a tie. Standing next to Jackson is musician Ben Branch. It is 6:01 p.m. when King asks Branch to play his favorite song, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," at the rally later that night. "Play it real pretty," King tells him. Just then, a shot rings out, and King is struck by a bullet in his right cheek, the bullet shattering his jaw as it travels down his spine and lodges in his shoulder. He falls backwards, blood pouring from his wound as Abernathy rushes out of the room to kneel beside him. Police at a nearby fire station arrive almost immediately. King's aides point across the street to the back of a building where the shot came from. It's the backside of a rooming house on Main Street. An ambulance arrives and an unconscious King is rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. He is pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. When police search the rooming house on Main Street, they find the sniper's nest in the communal bathroom, and down the street they find a rifle. Fingerprints in the bathroom match those on the rifle. The fingerprints belong to a drifter with a criminal record named James Earl Ray. Ray checks into the rooming house earlier that day using the name John Willard. James Earl Ray is arrested 2 months later at Heathrow Airport in London. He confesses to the murder, but then recants, claiming he's been framed by a government intelligence agency, specifically an agent named Raoul. Ray is convicted of King's murder and sentenced to life in prison. The response to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death is profound. In the week following his assassination, riots erupt in major cities across the United States, a reflection of the anger and disillusionment many feel after the violent death of a revered leader who practiced and preached nonviolence. In the wake of King's assassination, Walter Bailey, the owner of the Lorraine Motel, stops renting out room 306 and the adjoining room 307, keeping them as a memorial to the slain civil rights leader. In 1982, he sells the motel to the Martin Luther King Foundation, with the express desire to see the motel turned into a museum for King and the civil rights movement. In 1991, the former Lorraine Motel reopens as the National Civil Rights Museum. A large wreath hangs on the railing outside room 306, marking the spot where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on this day in 1968. At King's funeral 5 days later, his widow, Coretta Scott King, asks that a recording of the last sermon he gave at Ebenezer Baptist Church on February 4th, 1968, be played. In the sermon he gives 2 months earlier, he contemplates what he would want someone to say at his funeral, in his eulogy. He doesn't want them to mention his Nobel Peace Prize. He doesn't want them to mention his awards or where he went to school. Those things are not important.
I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace.
There are 271 days left in the year.